finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back this week. I hope you are surviving daylight savings with the clocks just turning ahead. And before we get actually into the show for part 2 of Fentanyl Inc. with our interview with Ben Westhoff, I just want to give you a quick message from Physician Financial Services, a business widely recognized in the physician community for disability insurance. Lawrence B. Keller, CFP, has been in the insurance and financial services industry since 1990. Unlike medicine, which is a standardized path that physicians must take to gain education, training, and experience requirements necessary to obtain board certification, the insurance and financial services industry does not. So while he might not be a doctor's first phone call regarding their insurance needs, he is often their last. Find Larry at drpodcastnetwork.com/Larry Keller or at the link in the description of this show.
Why do I need disability insurance? I've never done anything in my life that would possibly disable me.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I literally took side gigs that I could do from a wheelchair. So that's a different story. So this week we're going to finish up our talk with Ben Westhoff, just a tremendous guest and somebody with obviously a tremendous amount of courage to literally put his life on the line to get the information that he really needed to get on what is fentanyl, where does it come from, and then this week we're going to get into and how do we potentially combat this. Right. I mean, this is really, really rough. Like when you look at the number of fatalities and how we are going to click over the 50th anniversary on June 18th. Will be the 50th anniversary of the war on drugs. Wow. And if you look at the graph from from 1970 when it started to now, actually it'd be the 51st anniversary. I'm sorry, I was a year off. And you look at it, the graph is fairly stable but increasing in drug-related fatalities. And then you get to about 2 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it starts to shoulder up, and then it almost goes exponential. I mean, this is like where I want, it's not what you want for fatalities from drug overdoses, but it's definitely what you want in your penny stock portfolio.
You and your penny stock.
Like it really is ridiculous. But we have spent billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars on the war on drugs, and it doesn't seem to have really worked. Now, you could make the argument, well, it would have been even worse if we didn't do it, but, I mean, it's unprovable. But what's interesting about this week's interview is we're going to get into talking about some countries where it has worked, where they did things different, where they came, where they took the idea of harm reduction rather than just policing, and they're like, hey, it can't get any worse, so what if we just focused on harm reduction and what happened there? Really interesting stuff. Would encourage you to hang in there and listen to the rest of this. Or
even if you haven't listened to the first half, please go back after this. Stop, pause the show, go back, listen to the first half so it makes sense, and then join us back here again for the rest of this and catch up on it because it's fascinating. Fascinating.
All right, here we go.
Decapitate you, or was it like, no, this is just business as usual, just only in fentanyl?
Well, I didn't even tell the most sort of extreme part of the story, which was that I went to an actual lab where they made fentanyl analogs and these other drugs. And so that was in Shanghai. And I met this chemist who owned his own lab at a different train station. And he didn't really know what to make of me at first. I didn't actually say that I was a drug dealer myself. I said that my friend was a drug dealer and that I just happened to be in China. I wanted to check out this guy's lab, and if it passed muster, then I would tell my friend and he would place a big order. So this guy, this lab owner, kind of from the start, he suspected I might be a journalist, and he in fact asked me if I was a journalist a number of times, and I kept sort of deflecting and laughing it off, and then he took me to his apartment. He said we were going to meet first in his office. It ended up being his apartment, and he showed me this long list of all the NPS that they made. And then we kept talking. Then he wanted to go out to lunch. He asked me if I wanted to go to McDonald's. I said no. So we ended up going to kind of a local Chinese restaurant. And there he loosened up a little bit. I loosened up probably. And he decided he trusted me. And so he called his driver, who was kind of like maybe also the muscle of the operation. This is kind of where I got nervous when this driver showed up. And I was trying to keep track of where we were going on my phone, but you're not allowed to. American cell phones don't work in China, so I had this rented cell phone with this GPS that was not very functional, and I didn't really know where I was going. It was a big mess, and we started driving towards the outskirts of Shanghai, probably 30 minutes south of the city, and I don't read Mandarin. I was trying to text my translator, who was my contact where we were going, but it didn't do a very good job of it. And finally, we got to this lab, which was just in a regular office park. And we pulled in. There was, he flashed his card to get the mechanical arm to open so he could get into the parking lot. And we went up a couple flights of stairs and saw his lab. There were, it was kind of like the Breaking Bad style lab with, it also kind of reminded me of my college chemistry department. There was all this different types of glassware and beakers and Bunsen burners and machines for drying chemicals. There were about 5 employees working there. And so it was a fairly small operation. But what was shocking to me was the pure volume of these chemicals they were making. And they had all these 1 kilo bags of these different fentanyl analogs and synthetic cannabinoids like K2 and spice. All of these were in these big drums, these big barrels getting ready to be sent out. And it was shocking how much of it they were producing.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Breaking Bad, because that series started in like 2005 or something, and it was pretty outlandish when you think of it. This gigantic lab underneath a chicken processing plant and whatnot, and really what you're describing in the 15, 16 years since the genesis of that television show is with the psychonauts, with the novel psychoactive substances, with 100 different novel drugs being created a year. We don't have like Walter White out there. We have an army of Walter Whites that have an almost limitless ability to get precursors and produce these drugs that people are willing to experiment on themselves with and write about it and essentially market it.
Yeah, it's really true. A lot of people ask me what the U.S. government should do about China. And the U.S. government has tried to do a lot of things. They kind of they pressured China to ban fentanyl analogs, which they finally did in 2019. They have indicted all of these chemists and tried to arrest people. And China sometimes been helpful, sometimes not. But ultimately, I just think you can't really control it. These drugs are so easy to manipulate. They're so easy to make. There are so many people who are sharing information on the internet. It's almost impossible to stop their flow across borders. And so to me, it again goes back to harm reduction. And the only thing we can do is educate people and help them be more safe when they use these drugs. The problem right now isn't just that there's so much fentanyl in the US, it's that most people still don't even know what fentanyl is and don't realize that any powder, any pill that you buy off the black market could have fentanyl in it.
I'm sorry, what happened to our, our friends, the Reisers, where their son took, actually what he ended up taking was half of a Tylenol that he was told, I think, was either Xanax or Percocet. And when the police came and, analyzed the drug, they found nothing other than Tylenol in it. So he got the chunk of the adulterated Tylenol that had been sprayed more heavily with the, tincture of, carfentanil or who knows what it was. And, this is a big, robust, healthy young male. And that was it. And it's a perfect segue, I think, into, harm reduction, which, I mean, I don't want to get tangential, but I mean, if you look at COVID, we haven't looked at COVID as harm reduction. We've looked at COVID as, we're going to fight the invisible enemy, which is, it's a year now. It's a year since we started these lockdowns and all the rest of it. And it's, maybe if we would have looked at total harm reduction, we could have saved some people's jobs and livelihoods and shut down in different areas, maybe even more stringently. We did some things right. I think, the development of the vaccines that's an Apollo 11 story. So I don't see any way. I mean, I used to be the big, drugs are bad, we should outlaw them. I've become entirely libertarian when it comes to this, because you're never going to get rid of people's appetite for taking something and changing their mood. I mean, if you look, we've had evidence of opiate use for 8,000 years. I can't imagine that, Nixon proclaiming a war on drugs is somehow going to change this. And if anything, I mean, I think you could make arguments that it made it worse. So you mentioned before that the epidemic, the fatalities, the problem is really Canada and the United States. Why is that?
The reason is because of the opioid epidemic, the first wave with the overprescription of pills like OxyContin. And so, even as of recently, the U.S. was using 4 times the amount of opioids that the U.K. was. And I'm talking about legal opioids. So there's a culture of prescription here that is not really benefiting anyone. I mean, there's plenty of legitimate uses for opioids, but a doctor will tell you that after 6 weeks or so, you're not treating the original problem anymore. You're just maintaining, as you guys would obviously know, maintaining a habit. And so that led, as you know, to all this heroin use. And China has its own problem with heroin. China has its own problem with meth. There's places like Russia that certainly have opioid problems, but there's just so little reporting. It's kind of like a black box. It's hard to know. But in places like Vancouver, Colombia, it's not just fentanyl being mixed in with heroin and other drugs anymore. Now fentanyl has taken over the market, and that's all you can buy on the streets there. And so this is a very disturbing trend, because for a lot of people with opioid use disorder, using heroin all these years has only sort of maintained their habit. They don't get high anymore. They just kind of prevent the withdrawal symptoms. But with fentanyl, you can get high again. And it's starting, the drug dealers are starting to realize how much more profitable it is and how to cater to these people with opioid use disorder. And so I see it not only getting worse in our countries, but spreading to places like Europe and other countries.
So we were actually born in Canada and trained there. It's interesting you brought up Vancouver, British Columbia, because they literally have paramedics on bicycles wearing like a holster of Narcan. Because they can't, I mean, if you've ever driven in downtown Vancouver, you'll understand this. They can't get ambulances to where they need to fast enough to deliver Narcan to reverse, the potential opioid fatality. How
come? Is it just it's too crowded, or just like there's no roads down there? Or?
It's both. At one amazingly beautiful place, but as things grow, you outgrow. I mean, they don't build freeways. And so, and you get into the downtown core, and it's, it's like the downtown core of any major city. If you've ever,
plus it's highly residential in some of that area and
Right.
one-way streets, and it's just jam-packed.
it's like if you had to drive through the middle of Manhattan, it's absolutely no different. And so who's done it right? I mean, I know I did a little bit of research on Spain and Portugal. Portugal had a real problem with heroin, I know. What was it, like 45% of their HIV positives were just from IV drug use, needle sharing, and so forth. And they just said, okay, enough. We got to do what we're doing now is not working. Let's try something else. So what are they doing?
Yeah, Portugal has been a real success story in terms of decriminalizing drugs, and Spain too doesn't get as much publicity. But Spain, in particular, does not have a problem with NPS and fentanyl. And the harm reduction activists I've talked to there say that, people prefer traditional drugs really if they can get them. And they have supervised injection facilities all over the country, a lot of parts of Europe and Canada. And these are, as you know, places where people can legally use drugs. And they have doctors and nurses on staff to make sure that people, if they overdose, there's going to be someone to care for them, that they have clean needles and other equipment. In Vancouver, though, it's a strange situation because they have the sort of flagship supervised injection facility program there. And it's expanded. It has a lot of funding. There's undoubtedly a great harm reduction presence in Vancouver. And yet the overdose death rate has just continued to climb. The fentanyl use rate has continued to climb. And so, I'm not suggesting that any of these one methods are a panacea. And I'm not suggesting that we still don't have a ton of work to really figure out the best way to fight these problems. All I know is that things are only getting worse. Especially in the U.S. 2020, the statistics aren't out yet, but it looks to be by far the deadliest year in terms of drug deaths ever. And this is coming off like 4 or 5 years where it's getting worse almost every year. And so I just think we need a new approach. And pouring all this money, as we're still doing, into jailing people, into fighting these big wars, drug wars in places like Mexico and Colombia, it just doesn't seem like we're getting any return on our money at all.
No, and it's kind of a typically American way to, deal with a problem, which is, you fight a war on it. Well, that's fine. Civil War ended slavery, War of Independence, started the United States. You can debate on, whether these things were worth doing, but World War II, probably worth fighting, right? But you should only fight a war. If you talk to anybody in the military, you don't want it to be a fair fight. You only fight wars that you can win. And it seems like we've been fighting a lot of endless wars where they're kind of fool's errands. And, the war on poverty hasn't worked. And the war on drugs for sure hasn't worked. It's just turning 50 years old now. And then, you get all of these things that never go away. Like the DEA started because of the war on drugs. There was no DEA before that. And then, Nixon also ramped up the ATF. So, you get these federal police forces and all of this stuff. And it's just like, I guess what the paranoid side of me goes, is somebody going to come along and say, yeah, okay, we're going to get rid of these federal police forces that are now 50 years old that have this gigantic amount of funding? I would think obviously not. Maybe they can do something a little bit different in this war as we add these other concepts of really harm reduction. I love the part in your book where you said like Portugal doesn't have an NPS problem, partially because you go to a party or a rave or a gigantic festival and you can test the drugs that you bought. Tell us about drug testing. Not, peeing in a cup before you get a job, but actually testing the drug.
Yeah. Well, they call it drug checking just to slightly differentiate it. But the most powerful form of it are these fentanyl test strips. and they're basically like a pregnancy test. They're really cheap. They are just like a thin strip of paper. You mix up a solution of your drugs, you stick it in, and there's like one line if there's fentanyl and two if there's not. And they have these drug checking kits that can test for just about any drug you can think of. I always recommend a company called the Bunk Police, which I talk about in the book. It's just bunkpolice.com, and they sell really inexpensive kits. And so, if you're gonna, like I said, any pill or powder you get could have fentanyl in it. And you have no way of knowing if it's going to be real ecstasy. Now, since I have written the book, there is some real ecstasy has started to come back onto the market. But, why not test it? If it's the terms of risking your life, why not just have one of these kits on hand and see if you've really got what you think you do?
And those kits are legal, I'm assuming?
They are legal in most states. I think in Pennsylvania and Arizona, they weren't, but there's a movement to get them legalized.
Yeah, because that just seems, we live in a small town, 10,000 people. It's a logging town. And every single time we get the local paper, there's a big ad, like a quarter-page ad for Narcan, because there's been this huge push to have Narcan readily available. Go into a pharmacy, kind of no questions asked. You can get Narcan. They're taking it and putting it into, nasal applicators where you can sniff it like a nasal spray. The Good Samaritan laws, if you're doing drugs with your friend and he passes out and is potentially dying of an overdose, you can dose them with Narcan and not be charged. It seems like a no-brainer. If we're going to do that, then we should be doing the other side, which is the extensive drug testing and promoting that, because like you said, like what happened in Portugal is the market changed, correct? Like, it's if the illicit drug dealer knows that his drug is going to be tested, then they're more likely to sell something that's actually a less dangerous, not novel, old school drug, correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely true. You get a lot of examples of that. I think in Spain, they were able to track this kind of super deadly ecstasy pill called the Superman pill that originated in, I believe, England, and it went through the Netherlands and then was coming sort of south of Europe. And because they have the laws are friendly towards drug checking and reporting, they were able to track it. I went to the country of Slovenia, actually, where the police themselves actually check drugs for kids. You can bring your drugs to the police station and they'll tell you if it's what you think it is or not and give it back to you. So it's a whole different way of thinking about things over there.
Right. Well, and that's the thing is that, and again, there's a fine line because we're not advocating use. I like the guys. I think they changed their name to LEAP now, but it started out with law enforcement against prohibition. Really interesting group. I'd heard an interview several years ago by the founder, and he basically said, drug abuse is a terrible, awful problem, and criminality is a terrible, awful problem. But you don't want your solution to that problem, or to both of those problems, to make A, more drug abuse, which is awful, or more criminality, which is awful. Well, obviously, when you have a black market, you're going to increase criminality, and there's always going to be people that are going to, go down that kind of illicit business road. If you made potato chips illegal, you'd have a black market for it, and there'd be people shooting each other for bags of potato chips. Really. It's the nature of the black market. Now, obviously, potato chips kill you much more slowly than heroin or fentanyl. But at the same time, we prohibited alcohol, for the better part of a decade, and we might have had less social ills at the, in families from alcoholism, but we got a lot more social ills from illicit alcohol, poisoned alcohol, and the birth of some of the greatest gangs in the history of the country. And we repealed the Volstead Act not because all of a sudden everybody wanted to get wasted. It was because the criminality got so bad.
Yeah, and that's another rule of drug prohibition, which you just alluded to, is that when a drug is banned, it gets more powerful. And, just like these bootleggers, it was much easier to ship this moonshine and bathtub gin than big cases of beer, and so when people were making gin in their bathtub, they weren't always doing it right, and they blew themselves up in the process, or they made it, too potent. And the same is true with fentanyl. That's the rise of these super potent opioids is the same phenomenon.
Yeah, it's amazing how history repeats and how we are, loath to understand that. I just, and again, it's not, it's, I mean, I know people get into camps and, your crew, whether you're conservative or liberal or wherever, you don't have to take every single thing that your political bend or religion ascribes to. I liken this to COVID. We tend to be on the more libertarian to the right side politically, but I said you can own a gun, you can vote for Donald Trump, and you can still think that hydroxychloroquine has zero evidence. I mean, those things can be true at the same time. I mean, you can believe in the free market, you can believe in free market capitalism, and you can still think that, maybe it's, the war on drugs is a really bad idea and is actually making things worse.
Yeah, there's been this big shift in recent years, and that's maybe one of the only positive things about the opioid epidemic, is that people have started to see, drug abuse as a disease, as a problem, and not a sort of personal failing. And so this mind shift has been responsible for the allocation of all sorts of new resources towards fighting the problem. It hasn't made a dent yet, but I think that this overall mind shift is going to benefit our society going forward.
So, as you probably know, because we live in Oregon, we voted this fall, and it passed amongst the vote to decriminalize everything.
Yeah.
And so now I guess Oregon is the big guinea pig state for the country to see how things unfold with treatment programs, and instead of throwing people in jail, to get them into treatment facilities, etc. So it looks like, I'm thinking maybe other states might follow suit. Who knows? It seems like it's catching on.
It is a big experiment, and I think decriminalization has a lot of advantages. I mean, it's one thing to sort of be selling, having the state be selling drugs, and it's another for these laws to just sort of not be enforced. And there's a lot of people who think decriminalization has a lot of specific advantages. I will be very curious to see how it plays out in Oregon, and but if it's anything like Portugal and Spain, it could be very promising.
Yeah, my only concern is, I think the concept of decriminalization is good. I think it would be better if it was the entire country. You don't want to be kind of the only psychotic salt lick in the 50 states, so to speak. And I'm not convinced it's been entirely thought out. I mean, I kind of likened it to, you might really like wood heat, but that means that you should have a wood stove and burn wood in a fireplace in your house, and probably not make a campfire in the middle of your family room. And my concern is they're going to, there's the decriminalization, and there hasn't necessarily been a push as far as rehab, as far as this drug checking idea, where you get to, old school drugs that are safer. And my fear is they'll try the experiment, it will fail, and then, all the kind of traditional war on drug people will go, okay, see, that didn't work. Oregon's the worst place ever. Now we should, put even more funding into the gigantic police forces and all the stuff that, clearly hasn't worked for 50 years.
Yeah, well, that's the thing with these voter referendums is, they happen in a hurry and without much preparation. But, I think Oregon already had more harm reduction measures in place than your average state, so maybe it's not a bad place to do a staging ground.
Yeah, I think marijuana is, I mean, I guess it depends on what side of the debate you're on. But I think the legalization of marijuana has at least made that way safer. I mean,
time will tell.
Yeah, time will tell. I mean, it's been 5 years.
Yeah. There's this bad vape oil that is going around, and it has to do with these adulterants again that have killed a number of people. But marijuana themselves, the buds, if you could see the buds and smell them, it's not synthetic marijuana, K2 and spice, then you're going to be all right. Although there's the pesticides too. There's like, I hate to say it, but there's a lot of sort of cancer-causing pesticides that are used on. So buy organic if you can.
So is that going to be your next book, Pesticide Inc?
Oh, it's just too depressing to even think about all the stuff we're putting in our bodies.
Yeah, it's always something. But
I think it's the Kraft cheese slices that are most scary.
Yeah, don't get personal. Anyways, this has just been a spectacular discussion. I'm glad we got to get into a bit of the war on drugs coming up on its 50th anniversary, and just the concept of harm reduction in general. I mean, we see patients, and that's what we do. It's like, okay, you have this problem. What can we do to solve, whatever diagnosis that you have in the safest and most effective way? There's not a political bend on whether you have cancer. It's like, what do you want to do? You want to kill the cancer and not kill the patient. And, clearly this drug epidemic, reaching into these little towns that we live in, touching families in such an unbelievably tragic way is really like a cancer. And I think we need to look at it that way, Well,
and it's a rapidly growing one. And the sad thing is that there's a lot of people in the medical community, physicians, who are still needing, their eyes open to this and are unaware of what's going on with fentanyl itself. So I'm super excited and just grateful that you took the time to just investigate, write this book, and put yourself out there. Even going to China, that just freaks me out. But and this is awesome, spreading the word.
I was just going to say, you guys are doing great work too. And I think one of the biggest problems with doctors is that a lot of doctors just don't want to see opioid patients. And my dad is a doctor, and he talked about writing too many prescriptions, and he would inherit patients, and they would like sit in his waiting room and come back all the time, and they want more prescriptions. And it's like just trying to get people out of there. It's putting in the effort and the time.
Yeah, it's tough, but at the same time, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called the Pilgrim's Regress, and the whole point is if you're going down the wrong road, the way to solve that isn't to keep going down the wrong road; it's to stop, turn around, and go the opposite direction. And as a medical community, we need to own it. I wrote way too many opioid prescriptions. I can blame it on the government, the regulatory boards that told us that pain was the fifth vital sign, that we sucked at treating pain. When we moved to Oregon, we were sat down by the state licensing board and told about how we should treat patients with chronic pain because we suck at it. When we left family practice to go into urgent care, we were sat down in a building saying, "Don't write opioids. You're killing people. You suck at it." And so, and the groupthink in medicine, the peer pressure is quite immense. I mean, because you're dealing with people's health and their lives. And so, the thing that stuck out to me the most is these cheap test strips. Like we should be, that should be spammed everywhere, because that seems like incredibly low hanging fruit to just say, hey, if you're going to use something, test it. If you're going to use something, test it, because that's going to affect the drug market. It's going to affect people's behaviors. If we're going to dispense Narcan to virtually everyone, that one just seems like a complete no-brainer.
Yeah, the prevention side of it, and it's much cheaper. And at these music festivals, they should allow it. It's like banned in the U.S. That would be a great first step.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I mean, it's the new, maybe it'll be the mask of 2022. Instead of wearing masks, we just, everyone goes to, I mean, I go to a lot of shows and, it's just like, hey, you got test strips everywhere. You can go to the bar and you can order a gin and tonic and you can pick up some test strips for cheap or free or whatever.
I liken this to it just made me think of the birth control revolution. And, you can tell people to be abstinent and just don't have sex, but it still happens. You're going to have your back alley abortions with bad outcomes because people are going to do it. And so, then we finally got to the place where we're like, we should educate kids about birth control. Let's make it available. I mean, you can tell them to be abstinent and not have sex, just like don't do drugs, but it's going to happen. So let's protect people, give them the tools they need to stay safe, whether that's, condoms and birth control clinics, etc. And that's where we're at with drugs, really. I mean, that's what I see.
Yeah, I use that same analogy. It's so true, and especially with kids, you can tell kids to not do something till you're blue in the face, and they're not going to listen. So you have to give them the tools they need to do it safely.
Right, and usually they do it more. Like I love the Tipper Gore parental advisory stickers. I mean, that was the greatest thing that ever happened to music.
Best marketing.
It was like you couldn't have come up with a better market. Like not only is it an advisory, it's from the government and from the most uptight people in the government. It was like an endorsement. I mean, an absolute perfect endorsement for only buy these records.
Yeah, it's like when they tell you a movie is rated R because it has violence and sex and this stuff, and you're like, oh, well, it has sex.
Yeah, exactly. So now you want it. So this has been awesome. So glad to meet you and have you share your time with us. Can you just tell everybody that doesn't have their book like we do where they can get it and where they can find you?
Yeah, well, Fentanyl Inc. You can just Google it. You can buy it anywhere. My website is benwesthoff.com. You just Google me. Even if you spell my name a little wrong, you'll find me. But yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is a great discussion and good to really get the kind of clinical day-to-day side of it.
Indeed, Ben. Thank you so much for your hard work, for the risks that you've taken, and for allowing us to help get your message out. This is indeed a terrible, dangerous pandemic, and we just really appreciate your time.
So, by the way, you can find his book on Amazon.com, of course. You can get the paperback, which we have, and you can listen to the Audible version, which is what I'm doing because I love to listen while I'm driving in the car, if you prefer to do that as well. Highly encourage you. It's eye-opening. I think it should be mandatory, like we said, for med students, residents, and any physician in general practice, as well as anybody that has parents that are parents of kids. So before we end, gotta remind you not to forget to reach out to Larry Keller of Physician Financial Services for your disability insurance needs. He's been around for a while in many physician communities, helping them with the coverage they need. So find Larry at drpodcastnetwork.com/Larry Keller. The link will be in the show. I'll put the links to Ben's book in the show, as well as his webpage. And we just want to remind you, if you missed the first half, go back and listen. It's totally enlightening.
Totally enlightening. Mind blower. All right. We will, as always, see you next Thursday, and we'll be back again next Thursday
with
Doc Tales with Cocktails. See you then.
Bye.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit, uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS Free MD. See you next time.
A
try to keep BS Free MD as raw and real as possible, we can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bsfreemd.com.